This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Jenny Ifft, K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist, and Gaye Benfer, Assistant State Conservationist for Programs with NRCS, as they review how the Farm Bill and conservation programs are connected. Cassandra Olds, K-State veterinary entomologist, and Giovanni Moore, K-State Research and Extension Research Fellow, continue the show discussing how different times of burning pasture impact individual insects and ticks. Concluding today's show is K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk, as he encourages producers to work with their nutritionists to increase butterfat content and counter the drop in milk production due to the summer heat. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned into Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show, as we have been recently, with some more Farm Bill information. And this week, we're focusing more on conservation programs. And then to do that, we're joined by Jenny Ifft, K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist and Flinchville Agriculture Policy Chair, and Gaye Benfer, Assistant State Conservationist for Programs with NRCS. So starting off with obviously talking about Farm Bill and conservation today. So why does the Farm Bill cover conservation, Jenny?
Well, agricultural policy is about addressing shared problems in food and agriculture. Conservation policy goes back to the development of early farm bills during the Great Depression, when farmers on the Great Plains literally shared dust with legislators in Washington, D.C. And the visibility of that dust helped get this legislation passed and led to the creation of the NRCS as well as other institutions. If I step back a little bit and put on my economist hat, think about farm level practices that have public benefit or harm, so that the impact can go beyond the farm. So if you want to think of an example of something really negative, say dumping manure in a river. That can cause harm beyond the farm. There's also things you can do on the farm, say adopting practices to prevent erosion that have benefits beyond the farm. So either way, how you can address this is you can use a carrot or a stick. So if you think of a stick, you could have rules or regulations and you could have fines. This is mostly what the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, is responsible for. USDA programs, on the other hand, tend to be carrots. So providing payments to farmers to adopt some practices that have broader benefits to society. So those do tend to be a little bit more popular than what the EPA does, to say the least.
And something we've talked about a lot on this show recently is the Conservation Reserve Program. What was that like during the 1985 Farm Bill?
The CRP is a lot like the Soil Bank, which was a short-lived program during the Eisenhower era. And like you said, it was a part of the 1985 Farm Bill. What most CRP programs do is they pay farmers to take land out of production where a lot of environmental benefits are provided. Today, you have 23 million acres in the Conservation Reserve Program nationwide on 300,000 farms. So it's a really $1.8 billion a year. So it's a big program.
We do provide the technical assistance for the Farm Service Agency with the Conservation Reserve Program. And we have the opportunity to write the conservation plans, work with the producers on grass seedings, wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat. So, from NRCS's side, we definitely are able to get involved in those practices that are going on the ground. We also have, managed grazing and haying is one of the opportunities that producers have with the CRP contracts now. So NRCS does work with the producers on those grazing plans or the haying plans, whether it's managed as part of the contract or whether it's the availability for emergency situations.
And Jenny, you mentioned the carrot or stick method, and something that's a little more towards the stick method, conservation compliance.
This was also a part of the 1985 Farm Bill. To put it in context, sort of in the 60s and 70s, you had a growing environmental movement in the U.S. You had things like the Endangered Species Act passed during the Nixon administration in the 1970s. So there was broad public support for protecting the environment. This is part of the reason that got put in the Farm Bill. But the basic idea is there needs to be some minimum standard for environmental impact for eligibility for safety net payments. So some of those, payments that get paid out when yields or prices practices are lower, that a farmer can't just go farm a wetland or plow up native sod and still be eligible. So there's some rules there for what you need to do to be eligible. There's also something called highly erodible land. And this, you have to make sure you're taking care of it. It has to be certified by USDA before you can have eligibility for some of those other payments. But if you don't want to be involved, you just do what you want. It's private land, but then you lose eligibility for some payments.
Gaye, what does that interaction look like in Kansas now?
So in Kansas, over half of our acres are highly erodible land. We have over 25 million acres that are considered highly erodible. On top of that, we have acres that are considered potentially highly erodible that our field offices go out and look at and determine, depending on slope, length of slope, whether they're erodible or not. So that's just on top of that. So definitely opportunities to improve the environment there. Like Jennifer said, it is up to the producer, if they want to participate in USDA programs, to have that highly erodible land conservation plan. In Kansas, we probably have done 1,700 determinations a year for acres that are added and 400 wetland determinations. Not only do we deal with just the highly erodible land, we also deal with wetland compliance and ensuring that wetlands aren't necessarily converted to cropland. And, we work with the producers on those, work on the conservation plan on kind of how to mitigate those effects.
And another part of land, working lands, so EQIP and CSP.
So these programs are relatively newer, at least in their current form, but that's where a lot of the growth is in Farm Bill spending on conservation. Today, spending on these programs is larger than the Conservation Reserve Program. In fact, some programs like EQIP, that pays for individual practices. Some Conservation Stewardship Programs, CSP, that takes a farm level approach. But a lot of I think maybe nearly all years, there's more applications to this program than there are funds available. So it is quite popular. I think one of the reasons is because the practices that are sponsored tend to be win-win. There's some environmental benefit that justifies the public investment, but farms also benefit. You think of something like improving grazing management.
EQIP and CSP are definitely our programs that we have available for the working lands in Kansas. Our allocation this year for Kansas, we did start out with $28 million in EQIP and $6.8 million in CSP. On top of that, we were able to gain additional funds. So those are funds that we bring to Kansas to treat the natural resource concerns. Those allocations vary from year to year, but around $30 million is what we can estimate that we probably receive here in Kansas. With those funds, especially with EQIP, we see a lot of cover crops, nutrient management, terraces, waterways, those practices that are treating the concerns that we have here in Kansas of water conservation, grazing lands conservation, and soil health.
And another program that is also currently taking place is easement.
We do have the Agricultural Conservation Easements Program. There's two sections to that. There's agricultural land easements and wetland easements, and really that is just the opportunity to keep those lands in conservation in their natural state, whether it's for perpetuity or whether it's a 30-year easement. Just the opportunity to keep those lands from development, but also ensure that they meet those conservation standards. In Kansas, we have 429 easements. While it's not a large rush, there is still a lot of interest in that. And we have, as far as the agricultural land easements, we have some really good partners that we work with those.
Are there any other programs that we'd like to mention?
So in the last Farm Bill, we had the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, which really looks at, it's a partner-driven approach to voluntary conservation. And those partners can be private industry, non-governmental organizations, entities, tribes, local governments. So lots of opportunities there. It is with the Farm Bill, the funding has increased this year. So definitely opportunities there for Kansas to have some successful projects, but it all starts with those entities putting in a proposal. So the projects themselves are very targeted in their approach, and we have some really successful projects here in Kansas, like the Milford Lake watershed, where we specifically targeted practices that would help treat the sediment and nutrients that were going into Milford Lake that were, hitting those blue-green algae problems. So we did have the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed this year. So that really gives us a lot of additional opportunity right now on top of our Farm Bill funds. This year, Kansas received $3.3 million in EQIP and $4.8 in CSP and IRA funds. So that was on top of our additional Farm Bill allocation. But in the future, those amounts could multiply exponentially for the amount that would be available to Kansas. The difference in the IRA funds is that they are specifically targeted towards climate-smart practices that improve soil carbon, that reduce nitrogen losses. So practices like prescribed grazing, cover crops, nutrient management, grass and tree plantings. Really, that's what those funds are targeted to. But just a really great opportunity in the future with those funds.
Jenny, Gaye, any final comments you'd like to tell producers right now?
I'd just like to mention that these conservation programs are a growing part of the Farm Bill, and they have broad support well beyond agriculture. There's a lot of groups that are concerned about the environment. Conservation programs are about 4% of the total Farm Bill, but if you take out nutrition programs, they're 25% of all Farm Bill spending. So it is a substantial part. Or generally, right now, there's just a lot of federal and private funds out there for farmers to adopt practices that have environmental benefits. I personally think that there is a lot of opportunity for win-win. I also think, like anything, a healthy dose of skepticism is merited. So, really making sure, do these programs work for my farm? Especially for some of the private programs outside of USDA, does this make sense? How does this work? Will there be both, short and long-term benefits for an operation?
Yeah, I think with our Farm Bill and with the IRA funds, there are a lot of opportunities coming up for producers here in Kansas to treat their natural resource concerns. I would encourage producers, landowners, that do feel like they may have some concerns to visit their local field offices. It all starts with a conservation plan. That conservation plan is the basis for our financial assistance programs. So don't be afraid to visit your local USDA office.
And Gaye, if people are wanting to find out more information about these programs, where could they do that?
They can go to our website at nrcs.usda.gov and search for Kansas, and that should bring up our homepage, which will give them information about the programs that are specific here in Kansas.
That was Assistant State Conservationist for Programs with NRCS, Gaye Benfer, and K-State Agriculture Policy Specialist and Flinchball Agriculture Policy Chair, Jenny Ifft. The resource that Gaye mentioned will be linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we'll continue our Tuesday show now with a conversation about a research project that has been taking place. And then to talk about it, we have Prairie View A&M University student Giovanni Moore and veterinary entomologist for Kansas State University, Cassandra Olds. Giovanni, getting started with you. You're currently a student at Prairie View A&M University, and so what brought you to Kansas State University?
Specifically to get some more research experience, and this was the opportunity that unfolded before me, so I gladly took upon it.
And what are you studying at Prairie View?
I'm studying animal science with a focus of pre-vet.
And Giovanni, in terms of research, what research are you doing here?
I'm currently doing research with Dr. Cassandra Olds, doing a study over dung beetles and how they correlate with prescribed burning or patch burning. We're trying to see when is the best time for farmers to burn their pastures in order to see if it affects the dung beetle community, because prescribed burning affects weed suppression, and it also affects with plants growing better.
You're focusing kind of here on dung beetles for your research this summer. However, there is a few more insects and bugs that are related in this research.
Yeah. And so we're really lucky. We've got the K-State beef stocker unit, and they've actually been doing burning for about 4 years now. And so they've divided it up, and they've got 18 pastures, and 6 are burnt in the spring, 6 are burnt in the summer, and 6 are burnt in the fall. So it really gives us a great opportunity to look at what this does to the ecosystem and looking at our small creatures and how those impact our big creatures. And so the bigger sort of scope of this project is looking at how burning in different seasons might affect our positive insects like our dung beetles, who are great. They offer great ecosystem services. They remove the manure. They promote healthy grass. Just really fantastic little critters that we want to promote. But also, does it do anything to the things that we want to get rid of, like ticks and hornflies and things like that?
With this work, what are we kind of seeing?
With the dung beetles, we've seen that with burning in the springtime, that it's best for farmers to burn because there's more of them later on, and we see.
So burning in the spring is better for the population of dung beetles and seeing them continue on.
Yes.
So for producers maybe thinking about, I want to keep my dung beetles around, maybe if it's not how they've always done it, spring pasture burning for their management is a good thing.
At least early season-wise, we're still doing the counts and the trapping. But at least initially, it looks like we're getting about a third more beetles in our traps on spring burnt pastures than in our fall and summer. The diversity is the same, so it hasn't affected the number of species we found, or which it's just like overall there's just more of each of those species.
And talking about different species here, we also have flies and ticks, so not really a bug you want to keep around.
Yeah, and so we've seen a really, really big impact, and bearing in mind that this is 4 years straight of burning. So if a producer was to do this right now, it might take a few years to start seeing these kind of effects. But we're seeing significantly fewer ticks in burnt pastures overall. And so whether spring, fall, or summer, it doesn't really matter. Definitely less than our unburnt treatment area. However, we are finding that spring burning has, at least initially early on in the season, had the least number of ticks. But it's important to remember ticks don't go very far. They don't have wings, so they can't fly. And we actually had an area that was what we thought was our unburnt section. And on one side of the road, we put a trap, and on the other side of the road, we put another trap. And we were getting a lot of ticks on the one side of the road, but not on the other side of the road. A few weeks later, come to find out that that's actually a burnt area. So ticks don't travel. So when you're burning for ticks, you have to get, especially the areas under trees, that sort of brush that remains, anything that remains a pocket for these ticks. But definitely burning seemed to impact, have a pretty significant impact on the tick populations. And spring, at least early on, seemed to be the best. And then flies, horn flies are the ones we're looking at, and these are on the backs of the animal. And it's our primary concern for livestock producers are the horn flies. And this is somewhat less clear. The numbers are closer. And so horn flies fly, so you get them moving. So they're harder to sort of nail down, but it's looking like the fall and the spring pasture burns have lower numbers than the summer burn treatment. But again, early on, and we'll have animals coming off these pastures soon, and we can look and see how that relates to daily gains and stuff like that. But the really interesting thing is how these all tie together. So the dung beetles bury the manure, and the horn flies need the fresh manure above ground to breed. And so now we start asking really complicated questions like, is it the fire that's doing something, or is it because we have dung beetles more on the spring pasture, so they're burying more manure, so there's fewer flies? So it's not quite as straightforward, and so that's why we're starting to think more ecosystems based. What if I do this, how will this impact this species and this species and that species? So it's really fun.
And Cassandra, why would this be something that's important to producers?
Well, as many producers are becoming aware, these insects and these ticks, they're getting harder to control. And our climate conditions are getting more favorable for them to develop. And the products that we've been using, all the insecticides, we've been using them for so long, it's been decades now, that a lot of them are starting to either lose their efficacy or not work at all. And so we're going back to, I've got old extension reports from 100 years ago before we had these chemicals, and all these insects and how they were controlling them, that's almost what we're going to have to go back to, because there's no new products coming out on the market. And even if we do, the insects themselves are already super detoxified. They already have a lot of these resistance mechanisms. So it's not that there's anything new coming down the road that we can use. And so what we really need to be doing is shifting the way we manage our insect problems. And so taking the focus away from using insecticides and using things that will just ecosystem-based approaches where we can reduce the numbers at every turn. So, for example, if you've got a problem with stable flies, if you've got any vegetation that is just rotting, old hay bales, that's where they're breeding. Now we've got stable flies that are resistant to pesticides. If you can't use a pesticide, you've got to clean up that mess. So starting to get more information of what are these ways that we can promote beneficials, reduce the harmfuls without having to use pesticides. And many producers don't know, but Kansas has some of the most pesticide-resistant fly populations in the nation. especially our houseflies. I mean, I do work on this and I send them to colleagues, and new products that they've never seen before. They should not have any resistance to it, 100% resistant. And so, it's not the best claim to fame, but we've got a problem with our flies, and there's no new product that's going to solve this problem. And so we really need to start changing the way we manage our fly populations. And things like removing breeding sites is one of the best things you can do, because they have this explosive. Each fly can lay 100 eggs at a go. And so you can go from, and producers will often see this, oh, well, the flies weren't that bad last week, but now there's billions of them. It's because they have this explosive population. So each female fly laying 100 eggs every 2 days, you go from having a few flies to billions of flies in a week or two. And so the really, really key thing is removing breeding sites. And that's one of the things that the dung beetles do. They remove that breeding site. And so that's why it's so important to know, if we are burning, that we're not inadvertently making life harder for those little creatures who are trying to just bury that manure and take away our problem for us, really.
And this research isn't completed yet. You're still working through getting all of it kind of collected and maybe answering some more of those complex questions. Yeah,
we've been really privileged to have Giovanni, and she was part of the KSRE, K-State Research and Extension Fellowship Program, and they just bring in such wonderful people. Shout out to Dr. Wiley and her team for bringing all these amazing students who really do the heavy lifting for us. I mean, it's really hard to do all of these projects if you don't have hands. And so Giovanni's been putting out pig poop and collecting beetles and identifying beetles. And it's really the heavy lifting that they've done that have made this whole project possible even.
Sounds like quite the summer experience there, Giovanni. And so what has been your favorite part of this research?
My favorite part for sure is being out in the fields, in those pastures, seeing the views that's out there. Mine is like the small parts of like counting the flies or doing beetle identification. I really do like being out there in the field. So field work is pretty cool.
And if you would like to learn more about this research you've been working on, when will that probably be available?
Yeah, so we'll be finalizing the numbers in the next couple of weeks. The animals will be coming off pasture and then analyzing the data. So we're hoping that we'll have a pretty clear, well, at least as clear as the data can be. We'll have it finalized early next year. So hopefully we'll be able to get that information out through various, through extension agents, through field days, through interviews like this, as to what we've seen in the study in terms of spring, summer, fall burning. Get it out, the information out there before spring burning takes place, so that if they wanted to try something different, see how it worked, they have the option of giving it a go.
Ladies, I appreciate you taking the time to join me today and kind of discuss what you've been working on this summer.
Thank you. It's been great to be here.
That was veterinary entomologist for Kansas State University, Cassandra Olds, and Prairie View A&M University student and current Kansas State Research and Extension Research Fellow, Giovanni Moore. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead on Agriculture Today.
This is Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages producers to focus on Tier 1 production, especially fat content, to help increase margins this summer.
Today I'd like to talk to our Kansas dairy producers concerning our margin situation in the dairy industry. You know, as you look at your most recent milk check, you're probably not too impressed, and probably is causing at least some concern as you think about cash flow and things that you're going to have to do to get through the next few months. So today I'd like to visit just a little bit about some things that we could do on a practical basis that might actually help increase the margin on the dairy. You know, most of us are probably producing enough milk that we're meeting our Tier 1 marketing needs, so anything in addition that we produce would go into Tier 2, and obviously we'd take a deduction on that. So let's concentrate on what we could do with that Tier 1 mark to make it more valuable to our farm. One of the most obvious things that we can do is to look at what is the percentage of fat and what is the percentage of protein in that Tier 1 milk that we're shipping. The easiest one of those two to adjust is actually butterfat. So here's the issue in the summertime. We have heat stress. We all know that's going to reduce the percentage of butterfat in the milk that we're shipping. Number 2, it's summertime. It's hot. So we have a lot of issues with secondary fermentation in our feeds, both in the silo as well as what we offer in the feed bunk. How does that impact the fat test of the milk being produced by our herd? Well, there's some interesting things that are going on there. Number 1, it impacts gut health. As we feed some of these microbes that are growing in that feed, causing the heating, it's going to have a negative reaction in the gut of your cows. That negative reaction will reduce feed intake, but more importantly, it may also reduce the percent milk fat in the milk. So there are some very good feed additives, basically direct-fed microbials, that actually do control gut inflammation. Adding these to the ration will increase feed cost. However, if it increases the percent fat in the milk, it will likely more than offset the increased cost in feed. So you need to work with your nutritionist very carefully, trying to determine if there are opportunities for you to gain some additional dollars in the milk check through increasing the fat content of the milk that is being produced by the cows. As you consider these things, keep in mind that if you're a Holstein herd, really those percent fat numbers should be about 3.8. If it's anything below that, you probably have an opportunity. But again, you need to work with your nutritionist, carefully evaluating the feeds that you're feeding, carefully evaluating the presence of acidosis or subacute acidosis in the herd, which obviously also reduces the percent milk fat, as well as your heat abatement strategies to make sure that you're reducing the amount of heat stress on the animals as much as possible. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our dairy farmers to consider how they might use the percent fat in the milk they're shipping to increase their revenue on the farm.
Thanks, Mike. And while we have a minute, USDA and partners within a spotted lanternfly working group have developed a 5-year plan to control this invasive pest. Rod Bain has more.
Spotted lanternfly, an invasive pest that has been around for several years in many states. It's been a focus of concern in recent weeks in various northeastern states. To help combat this invasive species, USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service and partners formed a working group that recently released a 5-year strategy.
We have built a solid plan that sits on 3 major goals, and we've committed to supporting these goals with certain levels of funding and resources that will be able to see this plan through for this next 5 years. APHIS's Matt Travis says the 3-pronged approach emphasizes response, research, and outreach in efforts to reduce the spread and impacts of spotted lanternfly. It is the latest step in efforts to control the pest, an invasive species especially threatening to grape crops and grapevines, as well as the invasive tree species, tree of heaven. I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.